ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP, Shell, ConocoPhillips, Marathon, Valero. These 7 companies, when you look at their profits, just their raw profits, there is absolutely no comparison whatsoever. Nothing even comes close with any other industry at all. And what I'm concerned about is profits. And why am I concerned about profit? And why the subtitle is the world's most powerful industry is that I am equating profit with power. Profit is the cash on hand that the industry has left over to do with whatever it wants. And what it does, with very little comparison with any other sectors on the issues that I am concerned about here, is influence policymaking, influence decision-making. And I begin the book with the story of Standard Oil Company, then the largest corporation in the world, the largest oil company in the world, and certainly the largest in the United States. People were very upset with Standard Oil, as they were with the other trusts, the large corporations that had essentially gobbled up lots of other competitors, become very, very, very large, and in the concern of the people of the day, had become so large that they were so financially giant that they were controlling the government and controlling the government's decision-making, even controlling decisions about going to war. And people across the country organized in what's since been called the populist movement. They convinced Democrats, they convinced Republicans, they convinced states to pass laws, the federal government to pass laws, they convinced the judiciary. Many people were organizing for revolution. What they got was regulation. And some of the most important regulations in place today: the 8-hour workday, the 40-hour work week, the first campaign finance laws in the United States, and antitrust law. If the Standard Oil Trust had been called the Standard Oil Corporation, we would have anti-corporation laws in the United States. But instead we have antitrust laws. The focus was Standard Oil. And the concept of antitrust was that corporations should not be allowed to get so big that the government cannot regulate their activity. And the solution was to break up the trusts. And Roosevelt was the great trust buster. And the first target was Standard Oil. And Standard Oil in 1911 was broken up into 34 separate pieces. And why we're in such a similar moment today is, of course, that we have corporations, and it just so happens, in this case, it's the exact same corporation, that have gotten so large that they are exercising control over government decision-making. And we have an economy that is split in a very similar way, power being concentrated in the hands and money in a small sector of the economy, a small number of corporations, and the vast majority of people not reaping the benefits. Very similar situation to what we've been through already before in U.S. history. So ExxonMobil itself spent 14 times more money on lobbying between about 1989 and today, 14 times more on lobbying than it spent on campaign giving. As I said, I have worked on the Hill, and I can personally attest to the way this money just filters through every pore of government policymaking. The oil industry is always there. It is always making its point. It is always promising good things to come in the future if you follow its interests, and it always has more money than its challengers. See, the Sierra Club is the largest environmental organization in the United States. Does anyone have a guess of how big the Sierra Club's budget was last year? Total budget. $36 million was the Sierra Club's budget last year. $36 million. ExxonMobil last year made $40 billion just in profit. Just profit. Now, ExxonMobil is, of course, the example to use. In 2003, ExxonMobil earned the highest profits of any corporation in world history ever, adjusted for inflation, period. No one's ever made more money. They then topped it in 2004, topped it in 2005, topped it in 2006, topped it in 2007, are set to do it again in 2008. So I'm definitely picking a big target, but you get the inequality here. What that means is that when groups that are advocating on behalf of the environment, against offshore drilling, for example, on behalf of human rights, worker rights, consumer safety, the sheer dollars available to them, of course, utterly dwarfed. But that's just one other layer is lobbying. And that's just the companies lobbying. Because right now, the greatest lobbying force on Capitol Hill is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce spends twice as much on lobbying as the next lobbying group. And the next lobbying group is the American Medical Association. But then there are other avenues of influence that are less obvious. So, for example, on this issue of climate change, this is now a fairly well-known example with ExxonMobil, where ExxonMobil spent millions of dollars, particularly over the course of the 90s, but also into this century, funding climate skeptics. You know, three scientists who believe that climate change is not a real phenomena and 3 million who believe that it was, yet these three had a voice equal to these 3 million. Why was that? Well, one of the reasons why is because they were heavily funded by ExxonMobil. I would call them front groups that were being funded by the industry, but you would have to search to find that money. And fortunately, some people have searched to find that money.
Now, some politicians want to label carbon dioxide a pollutant. Imagine if they succeed. What would our lives be like then? Carbon dioxide. They call it pollution. We call it life.
You know, when I became governor of the great state of California, I promised that I would protect California's environment.
California is the third largest oil producing state in the country, and we have the largest oil companies in the world produce in our state. So it's Exxon, Shell, Occidental, Chevron.
Let's crush the car, terminate the waste, and have cleaner air and breathe easier.
And we tried to impose a very small tax on the oil companies for when they removed oil from the ground. California is one of the wealthiest states in the country, really in the world. We also, you may now know, just barely escaped asking the U.S. Treasury for a $7 billion bailout for our state because we're that broke. One of the reasons why we're that broke is while we are so wealthy as a state, we all but do not tax, in my opinion, are the wealthy among us and the corporations among us. So we tried to implement a tax, little teeny tiny tax. It became the most expensive ballot measure in the history of the United States. The oil industry spent $100 million to defeat this measure. For every $1 the proponents spent, the oil industry spent double, and they were always ready to spend 3 times, 4 times more. When the initiative was proposed to Californians, 65% said that they agreed with it. 5 months later, they voted against it, and it went down. And the reason why it went down, what people said at the polls, was that they were convinced that if they voted for it, their gas prices would rise. And that was due to being pounded with this message over and over and over again through commercials, through flyers, through independent research that showed that gas prices would rise. I quote the communications director who ran that campaign, who says, the hardest thing about running this campaign for the proponents of the measure was that when we launched a campaign against big oil, he says in California, Californians had no idea that big oil was who we were up against. Because everything they put out was done through front groups, was done. You never saw a Chevron CEO or executive speaking to the public. You never saw them quoted in the newspaper. You never saw a flyer that said no on Prop 87 by Chevron. And it was concluded that the main independent study that was quoted showing that gas prices would rise was funded by the oil industry. But we didn't learn that until later. And that was a model that they used continually and a model that was used in our state.
The societies which have achieved the most spectacular, broad-based economic progress.
I want us to restart the story in the 1980s because a pretty fundamental shift happened. And one of the things I'm very proud of in the book is that I was able to interview 3 of the past key heads of the Federal Trade Commission. This was the body set up to be our antitrust enforcer. And a fundamental shift happened in the Federal Trade Commission in the 1980s, where Reagan essentially decided that government regulation was a bad idea in general. And one of the areas where it was a particularly bad idea was in antitrust, and that we should really abandon the concept of trying to keep companies from merging. And the result was a lot of mergers. Beginning in the 1980s with the mega merger of Chevron purchasing Gulf, but then accelerating in the 90s because these policies continued under Clinton, under both Bushes. There have been 2,600 mergers since 1990 in the oil and gas industry alone. The mega mergers are the ones most of us are familiar with, but bode retelling. Exxon merging with Mobil. These were the two largest post-breakup pieces of Standard Oil. Chevron had already purchased Gulf, then it purchased Texaco, then it's purchased Unocal, and that's Chevron. Conoco and Phillips merged. BP purchased Amoco and Arco. Shell purchased many other smaller pieces, and these are the giant companies we have. Now, they also believe that we maintain, and I guess we do, a lot of brand loyalty, right? So you still see Amoco and Arco stations, even though they're all BP. You still see Chevron and Texaco stations, even though they're Chevron, et cetera. But there's only a few companies. Now those are the big names. Now what happened? Within the United States, one of the big fundamental changes that happened was a mass consolidation in the refinery sector and in the gas stations. So a very small number of companies bought up all the refineries, and a very small number of companies bought up all the gas stations. Such that there was this mythical thing, you might remember it, it was called the independent gas station and the independent refinery, kind of like the independent bookstore. The independents were competitors for price. The independents have been essentially pushed out. Not only that, but the companies closed down refineries. So they closed down about half of the refineries that were in existence before they started consolidating. They haven't built any new ones. Consolidation, concentration, pushing out competitors. What that has meant is more control over price. Instead of searching for oil outside, they went hunting for oil on Wall Street. So part of why they bought each other up was to consolidate their reserves. So that we now have Exxon and Chevron and BP and Shell and the large companies control 13% of the world's oil. They are now heavily vertically integrated, right? So the company owns the field, owns the pipeline, owns the refinery, owns the gas station, or leases the gas station, which means they have a tremendous amount of decision-making on price along the whole chain of events. The price of crude oil began its rise in the year 2000. This is a very important year and a very important moment and very important for our discussion of the financial markets right now. In the year 2000, the largest oil companies joined with the nation's largest banks and Enron to lobby the federal government. And in particular, they lobbied one guy, Senator Phil Gramm of Texas, to get him and to get the government to deregulate some pretty important sectors of the U.S. economy. One of those sectors was certain energy futures trades. And the first beneficiary of this deregulation was Enron, which is why it's referred to as the Enron loophole. Enron immediately put this deregulation to use on my home state of California through its own exchange called Enron Online. And Enron used Enron Online, a deregulated electricity exchange, to create a false scarcity in electricity by pushing electricity out of the state, by pushing the price up.
I do not believe I did not do anything wrong that was not in the interest, and all the time that I worked for Enron Corporation, that was in the interest of the shareholders of the company. And
I quote Enron energy traders in this book who say just amazing things about how they were kids playing in a playground. There was no rules, nobody was watching because it wasn't regulated. They knew that what they were doing was both morally reprehensible and potentially illegal, but nobody was going to catch them, so it didn't matter. And they played with our state such that our two public utilities went bankrupt, businesses went bankrupt, people's lives were thrown into danger because we had rolling blackouts of electricity. So there were times, it was 100-degree weather, you were in downtown San Francisco, you had no air conditioning, you had no ice water, very dangerous for many members of society.
Enron Online will change the markets for many, many commodities. It is creating an open, transparent marketplace that replaces the dark, blind system that existed. It is real simple. You turn on your computer, and it's right there. That's our vision. We're trying to change the world.
The Enron energy traders, however, live on. And guess where they work? They now work at the nation's oil companies. They now work at the nation's surviving banks. The two investment banks that have survived the crash are Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley. They have all but morphed into oil companies themselves. They have bought oil fields, they have bought oil pipelines, they have bought tankers. But more importantly, these two banks, together with BP, Shell, and Total, set up their own crude oil exchange, identical in concept to Enron Online, their own deregulated crude futures exchange on which to trade crude futures, over which there was zero U.S. government regulation. It was based in Atlanta, no U.S. government regulation. Enron's energy traders now trade in crude. They work for the banks, they work for the oil companies, and they work for hedge funds. And they are doing to crude what they did to electricity. And they are doing to the world what they did to California. Essentially, this began in 2000. This is the same time that oil prices began their rapid rise. The only equivalent rise in the price of oil, by the way, that we've experienced was in 1973 and in 1979. Periods of intentional manipulation of price. In those cases by OPEC nations. In this case, by energy traders who have not necessarily political objectives, as OPEC did at the time, but certainly economic objectives that have political ramifications. The price of oil really began its skyrocket in 2006. That is the precise moment when the number of trades of crude on the unregulated ICE, it's called ICE, the Intercontinental Exchange, surpassed those of crude being traded on the regulated New York Mercantile Exchange. That's when the price catapulted.
And I think that we should look at offshore drilling and implement it in a way that allows us to get some additional oil.
There's three basic reasons why the oil industry is making the mega profits it's making. One, of course, is consumption of their product. The other is the rapid rise in the price of crude. And the other is mass consolidation in the industry. Concentration, consolidation in the industry.
To develop all the energy we need in an environmentally friendly way.
It's going to be vital that we develop all sources of energy to fuel the future growth of the world economy and its growing population. It's going to be oil and gas, coal, nuclear, wind, and solar. We're going to need them all.
One of those examples is liquefied natural gas.
Natural gas is one of the world's cleanest fuels, but most of it is found far from where it's needed.
We have a number of different technologies that we're developing to ensure a reliable supply of natural gas for Europe.
We take the gas, liquefy it,
and that allows us to ship it over enormous distances.
ExxonMobil has found ways to transport as much as 80% more liquefied gas than was possible before, and bring more energy to more people all over the world.
There's a lot of debate and discussion around the topic of peak oil. What I will say in my framework on peak oil, and a person who I recommend folks read is a man named Mark Simmons. He wrote Twilight in the Desert, and he suggests that the entire world, not just the United States, which reached its peak in 1970, but the world has already reached its peak. It basically, production has peaked and will be on a downward slide. I'm not sure if that's right. I don't think anyone can say if that's right. The oil countries lie about how much oil they have. The oil companies lie about how much oil they have. No one knows for sure. What we do know for sure is that at this moment, and demand may in fact slack significantly if we remain in a recession, but at this moment, we consume between 4 and 6 barrels of oil for every one that we produce. We're going to run out. It's a non-renewable natural resource. The oil companies estimate, and they may be right, that there are trillions of barrels of oil offshore, that there's trillions of barrels of oil in the tar sands, that there's trillions of barrels of oil in the shale regions. Basically, if we let them go get it, they'll find plenty of oil. They may be right. I don't know. Nobody knows. We do know that there will be massive consequences of allowing them to pursue that agenda. Not to mention an agenda of pursuing the conventional oil that is out there. And the conventional oil, 50% of it just about is in just 3 countries, Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia.
Clean coal technology is something that can make America energy independent.
We need to no longer be dependent on Middle Eastern oil. Seems to me to imply that we are suffering some pretty serious consequences of being dependent on Middle Eastern oil. And if you listen to Alan Greenspan, the former head of the Federal Reserve, General Abizad, the former head of U.S. Central Command in Iraq, it is because the war in Iraq is about oil.
Because there's no easy oil anymore, people like Yap spend every day inventing new technologies, like the snake well, to get the oil that was previously impossible to get to.
One of the things I did, and it was very painstaking, and I hope you enjoy and reap the benefits of it, was to read through the 10K SEC tax filings that all the oil companies make for every year for many years. And these are big documents, and they're very boring, but I read them. And what I found was, first of all, it's very difficult to figure out exactly how much money the oil companies are spending on green energy. They really don't want you to calculate it. They put their green energy numbers into large categories, and those large categories include things like production in the tar sand region of Canada, which is 3 times more climate change inducing than regular production, and that's counted as a green energy investment. So I had to try and find the actual green energy investments, the stuff they advertise, right? The solar, the wind, the geothermal, the stuff that's in their commercials, right? They don't count clean coal. They give them a little bit of credit for not considering that that's a green technology. And so what I found by reading their tax returns, and I have to say, and if anyone reads my numbers, they may get annoyed at me depending on your perspective, I was very, very generous to what I counted for the oil companies so that no one could say that I wasn't being. The company that spent the most money on green alternatives in 2007 and 2006 was BP. However, being the best meant that it spent 4% of its total expenditures on green energy. Now, nice, 4% is nice, but does it qualify the company as beyond petroleum? The other companies were 2%, 0.5%, 0 for ExxonMobil in 2006. It then added some investments in 2007 to bump itself over that 0 margin. And suddenly, I mean, it's been wild, right, to watch ExxonMobil suddenly feel that it needs to embrace green energy. Lee Raymond was infamous, the former CEO of Exxon, for saying, why on earth would we invest in green energy? We are the most profitable industry in the history of the entire planet. Why would we do that? And now Exxon's trying to paint itself as a green energy company. It's amazing.
Why is your company not investing in renewables?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for giving me the opportunity to address the area of alternative fuel.
They do not intend to be energy companies. Do not believe their commercials.
On the energy balance.
How much have you invested in renewable energy, Mr. Simon?
And I will get to that, Mr. Chairman.
I only have 5 minutes. What is the investment in renewable energy, please?
Recognizing that we needed to do something of a great magnitude, we initiated the Global Climate and Energy Project at Stanford University, which is about
how much money are you
about
putting into
$100 million investment.
$100 million, but you made $40 billion last year.
Mr. Chairman, putting more money into something does not necessarily equal progress.
The reason why they're not making those investments, and at the same time, by the way, as they're framing themselves as green energy companies and not making those investments, they are simultaneously moving into the most environmentally destructive modes of oil production that we as humans have ever come up with. And that is tar sand production in Canada. Again, I go into great depth in the book. Shale production in the Midwest, offshore drilling. So while they are characterizing themselves as green on investments they're not making, they are also becoming, in my mind, even more environmentally destructive as companies. Offshore drilling now, particularly led by my state's most formidable oil company and the second most formidable oil company in the United States, Chevron. Now we're talking about, and they're doing, drilling at 1,000 feet, drilling at 5,000 feet. But anything deeper than 500 feet releases methane. Now, methane is a greenhouse gas at least 20 times more climate destructive than CO2. 20 times more. Every single hole. And anyone in the industry will tell you, and I quote them, I quote a Chevron executive in particular, who says about offshore drilling, and excuse my language, it's a total crapshoot. And he's an offshore drilling expert. You drill 100 holes, and 20 of them will give you oil. 80% are dry holes. But every single one of them releases methane. It's also very expensive, $120 million per hole. The drills are diamond encrusted, right? Fancy drills. $120 million per hole. And only 20% of them yield oil. This is in the Gulf. This is where we have the statistics. And we all know, because the Bush administration itself has said it would take, at least 10 years for sizable amounts of oil to come from offshore. And that's because of this crapshoot. Why everyone is sounding like a populist is because we are in such a similar economic moment that we were 100 years ago, over 100 years ago. So if we are going to allow the oil companies to remain oil companies, we and or they are going to have to continue to go to pretty extreme lengths to get that oil. And how are we going to make those decisions? How far are we going to let the oil companies go? How far are we going to go in pursuit of oil? And how democratic is the debate going to be when we make those decisions?
They have all the power. That's what they say, but we will turn those tables, take their power away. Yes, we will. Yes, we will. We will not be dissuaded, and we will not turn around. We will face the barricades, and we will tear them down. Yes, we will. Yes, we will.